Max Verstappen sets a scintillating pace in qualifying, but it is Charles Leclerc who will start the Belgian Grand Prix from pole position. From RacingNews365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined by lead editor Ian Parks, who is a bit wet because it has been a very damp day at Spa-Francorchamps. In fact, typically the driest part of the day was F1 quali. Of course, it was still wet on the track surface. Ian, we've got to talk about Verstappen because we said in the F1 update with his 10-place grid penalty, the best thing he could do would be to go fastest in qualifying. He did that by some margin and starts P11 for the race. He's in this. He can win this on Sunday.
He actually thinks that he faces a damage limitation exercise, to quote unquote him from his post-qualifying press conference. Hello, everybody, and a very warm, not quite the right word, but definitely very wet welcome. As you can see from Spa-Francorchamps behind me, it has rained pretty much throughout most of the day. As Nick rightly pointed out, the driest part of the day was in qualifying. At least for the most part, it didn't rain through the sessions until relatively late on, and then that played its part in Q3 especially. Only light rain, but right now it is absolutely pouring down. I know you can't quite see that behind me, but literally, it is really wet, wet, wet. So much so that they even decided to call off the F2 sprint race. Such was the level of water on the track, just too much, particularly for those young guys to arguably go through as well. So, but just getting back to Max, yes, absolutely. Poles apart, you could say, even though, of course, he's not on pole tomorrow. He will be starting from 11th position, but nevertheless, he and that RB20, this is his favourite track, by the way. He's won it past 2 years from an alternative grid slot when he's qualified on pole. Came from 14th in 2022, came from 6th last year. If he's going to win it, if he's going to complete the hat-trick tomorrow, Sunday, he's going to have to come from 11th. But as I say, he feels he faces damage limitation on the back of the fact that he's got the McLarens ahead of him in 4th and 5th. Lando Norris ahead of Piastri on those two positions. So Charles Leclerc on pole, Checo Perez starting second. Could he come into this? And we will get to him in a moment. Lewis Hamilton third, and then we got the two McLarens. You could argue that they're slightly out of position, but as far as the McLaren are concerned, they are actually quite happy with those slots because it is going to be dry tomorrow. That's the forecast. Don't hold me to that. The capricious nature of the Ardennes, you never know what's going to happen in this particular region. But for now, it's set to be dry. That will most definitely play into McLaren's hands because they were definitely quick on Friday practice. Certainly FP2, they look the best car out there in the dry. So, as I say though, Max has got to get past both of those guys. That's why he's thinking it's damage limitation, and he might actually just have to face a fight to get onto the podium, never mind score a hat-trick of wins from his alternative grid slot on Sunday.
Well, not only would it be a hat-trick of wins for an alternative grid slot, it would be, in general, his 4th consecutive win in the Belgian Grand Prix. Should he win on Sunday, which would match the outright record for most consecutive wins at Spa, currently held by Jim Clark and Ayrton Senna. So there's something on the line there. And you do feel that Verstappen's pace today, he's struggled recently. And there was an amazing stat, actually, that was on the F1 broadcast ahead of qualifying, and that Verstappen hadn't topped a session since Austria qualifying. He was scintillating in the qualifying today. He always comes alive in these mixed and tricky conditions where he just looks, as you mentioned yourself, poles apart. If he were to come through the field and win on Sunday, how big a moment would that be, not only for Red Bull, but also for the opposite reasons for McLaren, do you think?
I think it was quite defining for the Drivers' Championship situation, because we've been talking up Lando Norris a little bit. He's been chipping away at this points lead. You know, but obviously then on the flip side, certain points have been not so much thrown away, but certain situations where he could have scored more points than was possible. Obviously, last race in particular in Hungary, he could have had those extra 7 points if he'd have thought about the strategy correctly, i.e. giving back the place swiftly to his teammate Oscar Piastri, and then having, just as Andrea Stella has just called it in his post-quali debrief, 20 laps to potentially have a go at getting past Oscar, rather than spending this back and forth debate with his race engineer, Will Joseph, about, doing the right thing or not, and ultimately him having to do so, but too late to actually then go for any kind of win. So again, another one of those naive moments, you could say, from Lando, where, as I say, if he had thought about it correctly, the situation might have been very, very different last Sunday in Hungary. So as I say, it's been chipping away at these points. But if Max does come through and wins this one, then with what will be 11 races remaining after the summer break, you would have to assume that with what would be an 80 points plus advantage over Lando, depending on where Lando finishes and if Max wins the race, you've got to say that that surely would be too much for Lando to have an opportunity to come back and take the title of what would be Max's fourth successive title, of course. The Constructors' Championship, regardless of what Red Bull does tomorrow, that for me is still too close to call. Even if they were to finish 1-2 for argument's sake and McLaren 3-4 along those lines, I don't think that's going to be the case, and we'll come to our bold predictions later in this update video. But let's say that is the case. I still think, for me, the Constructors' Championship would still be not wide open, but definitely open, with McLaren, without a shadow of a doubt, in with a shot of usurping Red Bull as Constructors' Champions this season. It will be significant, but definitely for Max on his side of the garage and from his perspective. But for the teams, as I say, I still think there would be a lot to play for coming out of the Belgian Grand Prix on Sunday.
Absolutely. And just finally on Red Bull, you kind of mentioned his name a couple of times. We've got to talk about Sergio Perez, and I need to put my hands up and apologise to Checo, because my prediction was that he would start behind Max Verstappen, even with his 10-place grid penalty. He did significantly better than that. P2 on the grid at a time when Red Bull quite clearly needs him, with Max having his penalty ahead of both McLarens. That's half the job done for Checo. All he's got to do now is, as we discussed ahead of this race, ahead of this weekend, he now has a brilliant chance to not only put it on the podium, but also to potentially win on Sunday.
I don't think that's going to be the case. I genuinely cannot see Checo Perez winning the Belgian Grand Prix. His main role tomorrow, and I'd actually put this to Andrea in his post-quali session, and the drivers as well in particular, what are they expecting from Checo Perez? Because they have a Red Bull in front of them, but it's not Max Verstappen as you would ordinarily have anticipated. Instead, it's Checo Perez. So how much of a roadblock is Checo Perez going to be for the two McLaren drivers? Because ideally, they will need to clear him as quickly as possible to prevent, Max coming up as quickly as he will want to do from behind. That is going to be a crucial element of tomorrow's race. Naturally, this is a circuit, though, where overtaking is possible. You get that slipstream down the Kemmel Straight with the DRS, and you're as good as gone once you've made that move. So, but Checo Perez is most definitely going to have a major role to play. As I say, I don't think he's not going to be in contention for that race win. As much as he might feel he will want to be in contention for that race win, to finally end all those detracting noises that have gone on about his race seat over these past few weeks. But yes, he's got a big, big role to play, but it's going to be more for Max Verstappen and for Red Bull as a team rather than for himself. But of course, yes, he will most definitely want to prove that he's still got what it takes to continue in that Red Bull seat beyond the summer break.
And I suppose at least, he is in a position where Red Bull can use him to potentially hold up the McLarens for Max. And let's talk about McLaren in more detail, because fourth and fifth, whilst on paper, given their pace, would perhaps come across as disappointing, Lando in particular seemed somewhat upbeat, because I think he knows deep down that in the dry on Friday, McLaren were spectacular.
Yes, absolutely. And point well made. It's exactly the point that both drivers are making. They are absolutely confident of their pace in the dry. They are what occurred in qualifying today was that for the most part, most teams, McLaren especially, it was pointed out that they set their car up not for today's wet qualifying and the grid position, but for the race. So they are totally focused on that. They've got the wing level right coming out of practice on Friday. That looks particularly solid going into the race. So they are absolutely anticipating exceptional race pace for the Grand Prix. What they also have in their locker over Red Bull as well, and they believe this will seriously come into play, is they've got two sets of hard tyres. Red Bull has only got the one. So bear in mind this will be a two-stop race, given the high levels of degradation that we saw with the rubber on Friday in practice.
Really high.
Then you've got to think that the hard tyre is going to be the way to go for this Grand Prix. It's even been suggested, Nick, that because of the high levels of degradation, that even across 44 laps, we might see the odd car here and there going for three stops. Now, that would be quite something. It's a question of have the drivers and the teams got the relevant rubber to conduct a three-stop? How much of will it come into play against a two-stop strategy? Because obviously a three-stop, you could then be a lot quicker. You could push it hard on the tyres across all those stints. And of course, this is a short pit lane window as well. Because of the nature of the circuit here, it's a very short run in, pit stop done, very short run out to get back on track. It does lend itself to, as I say, a good track position coming out of those pit stops because of the undercut is extremely powerful here around Spa-Francorchamps.
And the thing you mentioned there, tyre degradation, has been so bad this week. In practice on Friday, some drivers on soft tyre doing one lap, one push-up, then complaining the tyres were gone. For Max as well, that's going to be a really important factor in that he has so many places to make up, but physically will not be able to really push to the limit unless he wants to sacrifice substantial tyre performance. But one driver, let's talk about the pole sitter, because we've discussed the main challenges for victory. Charles Leclerc perhaps isn't a challenger for victory, but to give him credit to his due, to Ferrari's due, put it on pole. Obviously, was second in qualifying, but inherited pole for the second year in a row in a very similar situation. He was surprised. It seems that Ferrari in general was surprised, but they've looked much better this weekend.
They have, yes, to a certain extent. Yeah. And obviously Charles admitted in the post-qualifying top three press conference that for him being on pole, yes, second fastest time, let's put it like that way, it was a major surprise. He was not anticipating that whatsoever. Third row, grid slot, P5 was the best that he was hoping for coming into the weekend. Yes, the conditions were very different, of course, and that lent itself to him being in that position. If it had been dry conditions, I think it would have been very, very different. He knows that, and he is anticipating, in fairness, the race to be quite tricky. And of course, when you're on pole at Spa, it's ideally not the best position to be in, simply because you come out of the opening last source hairpin, you head up that run through a Rouge and the top of Radio, and then if you are still leading out of your pole position, you are effectively a sitting duck, DRS or not, which you don't, of course, you don't have on the opening lap in the dry. You are a sitting duck for the guy directly behind you, which it could be Lewis, it could be Checo. We'll see how they are coming out of last source. So, as I say, pole position is lovely, but not at Spa-Francorchamps. It really does lend itself to you being attacked on that main straight, the Camel, because more than likely you've got to really defend hard and you are going to likely come off second best.
And also the big difference this year is that even if Leclerc somehow manages to remain in the lead for the opening lap, DRS will come into effect on the second lap. So it just makes his life that much harder. And obviously you mentioned there, obviously, the power of the Camel Straight for the drivers who are behind the pole sitter. The one who's arguably in the best position based on obviously recent years in the opening lap is Lewis Hamilton. Starts in P3. Again, we know how good he is in these mixed conditions, but somewhat downbeat about Mercedes' chances, if given that it has been a tough weekend, particularly in the drive for the Silver Arrows?
Yeah, there is a glimmer of hope for Mercedes, and that glimmer of hope is they didn't look great. Let's just put it that way out of Friday practice. So what they did
Yeah.
coming out of Friday, going into today, Saturday, was they changed the floor on the car. They came here with a new spec floor. It hasn't really worked for them. So they've taken that floor off. They will analyze the data from it beyond this race weekend. And you can imagine that they're going to be looking at that in depth to understand why it didn't quite work at this circuit. It's even more striking, Nick, when you think that, okay, it's a similar circuit in many respects to Silverstone, where the Mercedes was mighty around there, as we saw. We thought, this is it. Mercedes is definitely back. And then you come to a circuit like this, given the downforce levels that are required, and you would expect it to have worked in a very similar way. And with the addition of this new floor, you would have actually have expected an improvement. That's not materialized, sadly for them. So they've made this floor change. The car did look better, but again, take that with a pinch of salt because it is the wet conditions. Lewis, as we know, loves the wet. So he was naturally hoping coming out of Friday for these wet conditions. He did look good, but then Lewis, as I say, does look good in the wet. But he is hoping that with that floor change, that will at least lend itself to him and George having a better race in the dry. Mercedes, as we know, has always had good race pace so far this season, or for the most part of this season, ever since they started applying these updates on the car. So it's got a chance of a podium, said Lewis. It's a small chance, but of course, he's got the two McLarens behind him, and of course, he's going to have Max coming through as well. So I don't anticipate at this stage Lewis being on that podium. I think it's going to be, I'm going to go for, and I'm going to make my bold prediction straight away, Nick, before you ask me the question. I'm going to go for a Lando victory, Max second, Oscar third. There you go. There's my top three prediction.
Interesting. Of course, just to quickly go back to Mercedes, the fact they've made this change and obviously they've not yet run it in dry conditions at Spa. They're very much the unknown team going into the race on Sunday, but obviously there is so much unknown. In terms of the top 10 on the grid very quickly, obviously it is Charles Leclerc on par with Sergio Perez in second, Hamilton third, Norris fourth, Oscar Piastri in fifth, George Russell sixth, Carlos Sainz seventh with Fernando Alonso in eighth, Esteban Ocon P9 and Alex Albon in P10, who actually would have knocked out Sergio Perez in Q2 had he gone 0.004 of a second faster, was eliminated by just 0.003 of a second. So very fine margins for Checo, but luck was on his side this time. And actually, for my bold prediction, as I perhaps wasn't the kindest to him ahead of qualifying, I'm going to go for something very bold, a Sergio Perez win. Sergio Perez in first, Norris second, Max third. You know what? He's had this habit in the past when just when you think he's down and out, he pops up with these ridiculous results. And actually, I don't think anyone expected him to be on the front row today. He's not normally a driver who excels in these mixed conditions. The fact he did, you never know. It's Spa. Crazy things have happened. Ian, get back in the dry. Amazing stuff, as always. From myself and Ian, this has been the Racing News 365.com F1 update. Be back on Sunday evening to find out everything that happened in the race. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you tomorrow. See you later.
Take care, folks.